they just were a bit nervous about Athy creating this monster of a track and throwing people down it. We had to almost persuade them that it would work. And messages and messages, like angry people, like really upset, you know, threatening me, like kids' mums who were like taking part in the event, messaging me, you don't know what you're doing, you've had too many concussions, I'm going to sue you. Is this okay, or do we need to stop it? We've always approached it with this mindset of how far can we push this, and you know, perhaps we're close to reaching a limit of the track which we're on now.
You know, Red Bull are keen, and everyone's keen to push Hardline forward as a series. One thing I've been surprised at is how many countries want Hardline.
You've put a second venue into Hardline mix. Will it be easier to add a third, do you think? Dan and Gee Atherton, welcome to the Downtime podcast. How are you both?
Very good. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. And we're here to cover the history of Red Bull Hardline up until now, where we're facing the 2025 event in Wales. Dan, just give us a little bit of an overview about where the idea for Hardline came from in the first place, because we're talking the first event was 2014. There's a bit of planning to be done. So 2013-ish, what was going on in your head?
Yeah, it's actually mad to think back and think it's been 11 years now since the first Hardline. And I think the idea came from us and Red Bull getting together like we do every year, and just kind of, they said, you know, nothing's off the table, just come up with an event that kind of just redefines everything, you know. And for ages we were thinking about all these wacky events and trying to come up with something crazy and new, and in the end we just thought, let's just keep it simple and just have the toughest downhill race. You know, that's what we'd always done, that's what we were about, and so, you know, it made sense.
Yeah, definitely. And you were, at that point in time, you were making the move over to Dyfi, right? Is that what was going on in your life? That was bringing you over this way, right?
Yeah, and that was probably, that had a bit of an influence on it. I think, you know, for ages I was looking around at the map and kind of thinking where to base ourselves, and we knew we had this idea in the back of our minds that we wanted to do a bike park, and I think Hardline was like a stepping stone towards that. I think in my head I knew that if we were going to start a bike park, then the most important thing was to promote the area. Yeah. And bringing a Hardline event along with Red Bull to an area like this was huge.
Yeah, how did you find the site then? Because it's, it's not the most accessible place in the world, and it's a gnarly old hillside. How did you come across it?
We'd actually been riding there for years, just kind of illegally building trails in there. Probably one of my first memories of it was Steve Pete and Nigel Page came over. They drove like 4 hours all the way here, and then we literally got out of the van, got to the top. Petey crashed first corner, broke his finger, drove all the way home again.
Oh man!
The reason Hardline has done so well is because Athy has always had this love of just making really hard tracks and taking people to it and watching them have to take on the awful things that he's built. And that's exactly where Hardline came from.
And that hillside is perfect for it, right? Like, it's a gnarly mash of trees, rocks, gradient, water. Like, it's a horrible thing for most people, but you obviously revel in digging on that and making something out of it.
Yes, it's actually pretty unique to find a mountain like that around, you know, where it's got, you know, everything from big rocks to trees to good dirt for building jumps, you know, and yeah, it's all in one place. It's pretty close to the main road, and it's got this incredible waterfall running down the middle of it. It's, yeah, visually pretty impressive.
Yeah, it's an amazing place. And we're all obviously familiar with like digging cheeky trails and cutting them in, but when you create an event like Red Bull Hardline, like, you can't just build a cheeky trail and show the world on their live stream. How do you go about getting permissions and getting everything in place to be able to do the event on that hill?
Well, funnily enough, talking about cheeky trails, we were probably 2 months away from the first event, and Red Bull was still kind of umming and ahhing. They weren't sure whether it was a goer. you know, we hadn't had permission from the landowner. Everything was kind of up in the air. And I was just like, you know what, if we don't go now, we're going to miss the event. And so we were paying I just said to the boys, let's get started. We paid for everything out of our back pockets. And 6 weeks out from the event, Red Bull said, yes, let's do it. So it was pretty lucky, but definitely like on the edge for a while.
Yeah, so it started out as a cheeky build.
Exactly. It was a cheeky build right from the start.
Yeah, and that's quite a mind-blowing thing to think about now when you look at it as such a big event and the success that it's got now. But when we suggested it to Red Bull, they were kind of umming and ahhing about whether it would work. They didn't like the idea. We had to almost persuade them that it would work and that it was quite a cool idea. And I think they just were a bit nervous about Athy creating this, you know, monster of a track and throwing people down it.
I think it was the scale of it, really. You know, nothing had really been done on that scale before, and you know, the cost and, you know, how many people were involved, and it was just kind of, it was like breaking new ground on a lot of different fronts. And so rightly so, Red Bull were cautious.
Yeah, fair play. And it was a huge build done in not that much time by the sounds of it. And the road drop was in the first year, right? I mean, that in and of itself is a huge construction. Yeah,
that was an insane amount of work. And we were super lucky to have my Rachel's boyfriend, Ollie Davey, amazing carpenter, you know, and he, you know, we looked at it and we were like, we want to jump from there to there, and we were going to do it all out of dirt. You know, we were going to fill in the rocks with dirt because that's kind of the way our brains work. But he was like, let's do it out of wood and let's create this amazing natural kind of wooden structure on top of the rocks. And yeah, you know, without that road gap never would have been born. So big respect to Ollie.
Yeah, fair play, Ollie. And it's now probably the biggest downhill race on the planet, I think. Like, it probably attracts more spectators and more online views than any other downhill race. But back in 2014, there were no spectators, right? It was a closed event.
Yeah, I think those early events were kind of, we didn't really know what it was or what it needed to be or what it would turn into. And, you know, we said there that Red Bull were nervous when we suggested the idea. They were even more nervous when they turned up and seen the track. You know, it didn't put them at ease at all.
No, I can imagine.
They'd been on the fence about it, and then they turned up to see what we'd built, and they were thinking, well, we've probably made the wrong decision here. So, you know, we didn't know if it was an event that people would want to watch or whether it was just an event a couple of people would turn up and stumble down the hill and never come back to. So it was hard to picture what it would look like, what it would be, what it would turn into, and we had no idea that it would turn into this, you know, the size and the scale of what it has done now.
Yeah, it's been amazing to watch. And rider like selection is a big part of it, Dan, especially that first year, right? Because you're inviting people to something that, I mean, you've taken Steve Peat there and killed him in the first corner, so it's obviously a gnarly setup. Like, how did you approach working out who were the right people to bring that first year?
Well, I think, like Gee was saying, Red Bull were really cautious and really nervous that first year. But if Hardline has taught me anything over the years, it's that you cannot underestimate how good the pros are, you know, how good these riders are. And people watch Hardline and people see the road gap and they see all these things and they know that they're difficult, but it's insane how good the riders are and how easy they make it look. And every year we build stuff and I'm like, oh, I don't know, this is like right on the edge, and the guys come along and they ride it so easily. And that first year the invite list was, you know, literally, who can we get to do this? Because it was so intimidating and it was so daunting and it was so different, and it was smack bang in the middle of a World Cup season. And I think it wasn't a case of us picking riders, it was a case of asking riders, you know?
Yeah, it was a hard sell those early years.
First 3 years were insane. Like, one year we were down to like 6 or 7 riders for the final, you know. There was a solid start list. Then when we get to the event, people drop out because the risk's too high.
Yeah.
And then when practice starts and people just start ending themselves. Like
I remember we were calling round friends like midway through the event, like, you know, we don't have enough people. Like, are you interested in coming and riding?
Wow.
And they were umming and ahhing, you know, like, no, not really. Like, it doesn't really appeal to me. And then it started to build a bit of momentum. And once we got over those initial first years of teething issues,
Yeah.
you know, suddenly people were looking at it in a different light. They were looking at it, you know, actually that looks quite a cool event, actually, you know, and the coverage it was started to get, and that happened quite quickly.
And we learned a lot.
Yeah, I think learning what worked and what didn't work in the track. You know, I remember early years, there was a feature after the road gap, you landed, snapped around that right hander, and then Athy had put in this, it was like a berm into a shark fin hip. And I remember, like, the first day, Athy, or the week before, Athy had hit it. He jumped it himself. He'd built it, tested it, hit it himself, decided, right, I can do it. Everyone will be able to do it. Everyone turned up and said, absolutely no chance. No one wanted it in there. So we were back on the machine, getting rid of it, digging it out. So it was really hard to tell, like, what was and wasn't okay, you know.
Yeah, finding that line.
Yeah,
for sure.
And it was basically us building it, testing it ourselves. If we'd get through it, we think that should be fine. If we'd write ourselves off, which happened quite often, we decide, you know, that needs tweaking.
Yeah, fair. So 2014, then the first event, and Gee, I think you were coming in with the World Championship stripes that year. You must have been pretty keen to take the win, like home track, your event. Like, I'm assuming you were there to take the victory, and it didn't quite go your way.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I was there to win the damn thing, and thought it would be a bit of a breeze, to be honest, and absolutely didn't happen.
Absolutely not.
Yeah, I thought local track, I've ridden it loads, you know, I'm comfortable in these conditions. It'll be pretty chilled, but yeah, Hardline had other plans for me.
Yeah, and it was Danny Hart took the win that first year, Dan Atherton in second place, and a young Loic Bruni in third. You've sort of struggled to get Loic to come back after that first year, eh? He's got a bit weird, serious about that World Cup stuff. Did you scare him?
Well, he's kind of doing all right, isn't he?
He'll be back. There's still time.
He'll be back for more. So yeah, changes then. After that first year, like coming into 2015, you obviously had a lot more time, and I'm sure you learnt a lot from the first event. Like, what were the bits that you wanted to go and tweak and change on the track to start that process of making it a maybe more raceable and like less, I mean, still intimidating, still dangerous, still hard, but like maybe a slightly less dangerous track?
I think it took 3 years for me to get my head around the build side of things. And, you know, when we first started, I was taking inspiration from BMX and skate park, and we were building things that didn't really work on a bigger scale. Like, I remember one kind of shark fin, like with like a steep lip on the end of it. And in BMX, it would work. You know, the wheels are smaller and the tire pressure is harder. And I remember we built it. I think it was the second or third year we built it, and I tested it, and I had the worst crash of my life. You know, as I went off the lip, my tires rolled, even though they were so hard. My tires just rolled, like the whole wheel just flexed and like spat me, and I kind of carried on turning in the air. And it was one of the biggest crashes I've ever had, like just bailing off from such a big height. And from that point, you kind of learn that the forces are different with the speed, and, you know, the transitions just don't really work being that tight with that much speed. So, and then getting feedback from the riders as well is a huge thing, you know, because you've got such an array of talent there and such a, you know, wide range of skills that everyone feeds back to you, and you get so much knowledge. And after year 3, I think that's when it started to really kind of stabilize, and we weren't injuring too many people.
I remember that crash. You were testing, and me and Rach were at a World Cup, and we get a phone call, and someone's shouting down the phone, how do we relocate Athy's dislocated shoulder?
Oh man.
And me and Rach are listening, we can hear yelling and shouting, and Athy's like passing out with pain, like they're trying to pop his shoulder back in. And when he gets to hospital later on, they're like, yeah, he's not dislocated it, he's shattered the back of his shoulder blade.
So this was your scapula? Is that the one when you did your scapula?
I think it must have been.
Yeah, like snapped the whole joint off and dropped down. And I kind of assumed it was dislocated because it was so far down. So the boys were trying to pull it up. It was like two lads pulling it back up. And I was like, I'm sure this isn't right. But yeah.
Gnarly. And again, for 2015, Gee, the win escaped you, punctures weren't on your side. And it was a young Rory Cunningham that took the win that year, who's now the director of gravity for Warner Brothers Discovery. And like, I've heard you say that you guys kind of built Hardline because you felt like World Cups were getting too easy. Rory's now the man sort of responsible for those tracks. He's a previous Hardline winner. Like, what's your take on where World Cup tracks are going at the moment? Because there seems to be like varying takes on that side of things. Dan, we'll start with you maybe.
Yeah, I mean, it's so hard, isn't it? Like, what the guys are trying to achieve on TV, that consistency and that kind of exciting like race series is so different to like a unique one-off event like Hardline. And a race organizer does have a responsibility to the riders, you know, in terms of like keeping them safe. And that's something that we've talked about with Red Bull, you know, and, you know, Red Bull are keen and everyone's keen to push Hardline forward as a series. But, you know, you do have a responsibility to keep the riders safe, and everyone's trying to push the sport. Everyone's trying to progress the sport, but it needs to be like a reasonable level.
Yeah, tricky balance. Gee, you've been at some races recently. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, it is, like you say, a tricky balance. And I think, you know, what they're doing with the World Cups at the moment I think is good. You know, it's easy to rag on it, and a lot of people are, you know, it's a trend to
For
pick
sure.
what's going wrong and to kick them. But, you know, what they're doing, I think, is a good thing. And the changes are, you know, are heading in the right direction. And there's bound to be teething issues in the meantime, but they're definitely sorting those out. And, you know, you can't pick an event like Hardline and just say, let's make the World Cups like that, because you know, we see the issues that come with Hardline. Like, it's incredibly difficult to do. And, you know, Red Bull are great at what they do, and they get around the problems in a unique way that a lot of people wouldn't be able to. But, you know, the World Cup tracks couldn't be what Hardline is.
Yeah.
You just wouldn't have people left at the end of a 10-round season. And, you know, nothing would make me happier than 10 Hardlines, you know, of that caliber, but you couldn't do it.
Yeah.
I think as well, if you tried to do it, it would inevitably dub itself down, because if you just pulling together 10 events with 10, you know, expecting riders to come to 10 events, like Gee said, you wouldn't have anything left at the end of it, and so inevitably you'd scale it back a bit, and that is kind of getting away from the point of Hardline. You know, I think Hardline is so unique in that it's a one-off. I mean, yes, we're pushing more events, but they're all quite one-off, and you can push the bar so hard at those one-off events, which you couldn't do if you were trying to do a series. So I think yes, we want to push Hardline and we want to progress it, and, you know, but I think it's really important that it stays one-off and it stays quite small, and everyone's kind of willing to risk it for that one-off event. And so then the sport takes a jump forward, you know, in progression.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's always been about progression, right? You wanted to help drive the sport forward, and it feels like it's done it, right? You've only got to look at the level of riding that's taking place at Hardline now compared to 11 years ago. Like, it's wild how much it's progressed and how much it's so much more of a race now than it was. It used to be like a battle for survival almost, or it felt like watching it that was the case. And now, like, most people are getting through the weeks, and you're seeing people like fully tapped on like an actual, like, legit insane race run, which is wild. Yeah,
and I think we've almost had to work like looking ahead and looking into the future a little bit with Hardline. I mean, you can't build a track for what you feel is comfortable now. You almost need to think, right, what could the riders do? What can the riders do when they're comfortable? And, you know, push them on. And like Athy said, whenever we've built stuff in the past, you know, the amount of times we've been up there looking at something thinking, perhaps we've gone too far with this, and then all the boys turn up and someone sends it through, and then a load of boys follow them through, and then suddenly they're just chilling and comfortable. And last year was a good example. That top section is so gnarly, and when we were looking at it, we walked it multiple times with Red Bull, and they were looking at the big drops off to the side, and the cliff edges and the awkward steep rocky. And then you cut to finals, and Ronan's there just sprinting into it, like pre-hopping in, just like as comfortable as he's ever been on a bike, just charging down it. And it's mind-blowing to think that we were worried that was too much. And then you think, right, there's another event the year after, we need to make it harder again. Like, where do you go from there? You've just got to push and constantly be kind of one step ahead.
Building tomorrow's track, I guess, like looking forward,
which is hard to do.
Definitely, but it's cool that someone's doing it and making it happen. Let's come back to your battle, G, right? So we went through 15, didn't happen. 16, didn't happen. I think Bernard took his first win in 16. 17, it was Craig Evans. And then 2018, it came together for you finally. Like, how much did that mean? I mean, like we say, home track, and you've wanted it for 4 years at this point.
Yeah, a massive moment. And I think, every year I didn't manage to do it, just built it up a bit more in my mind. And I remember the year before that, when I forget what happened, either a crash or a mechanical. Being after the race, I was so angry. Like, I was surprised how upset I was that I'd not managed to win it again. So eventually crossing that line and seeing that I'd managed to do it, crossing the line at Hardline is an amazing feeling anyway. And that's something I always notice. You watch the eyes of the riders as they cross the line in their finals run. You can see this exhilaration that they've got down the hill. This absolute fire in their eyes, and just because they've made it down. And
does it feel different to a World Cup then, or a World Championships run, or whatever? Like, is there a different vibe at the bottom?
I think so. Yeah.
I don't think I've ever seen you so emotional. As after that win at Hardline. And probably the year before when you lost as well. Like, emotions are so high, it's crazy.
But I think it's because you've got the emotion of the event and wanting to be successful and wanting to do well, but you've also got the emotion of survival. You've got the emotion of you're nervous on the start line because you genuinely want to be okay. You genuinely want to get through the next 5 minutes, and you're worried for your physical safety. So when you add in that and the race, the pressure of the nerves of the race, it is an intense couple of days.
Has that changed for you guys? Like, that feeling that you get pre a race run at Hardline, say now, compared to like the first few years? Do you feel more comfortable at the event or not?
No, it's still terrifying. I mean, I don't. Nobody is sat at the top of Hardline knowing that they've got to go as fast as they can down this track. Wales or Tasmania, you just are nervous. It is a scary couple of minutes. Just purely because of the intensity of it. You're hitting huge features, but you're hitting one after the other. You land off one feature and straight away the next one's coming up, and there's just this barrage of information that you have to process. This huge amount of data that you have to process at an incredible speed, and have to have absolutely perfect braking points, acceleration points, landing points, speed from the previous feature into the next feature. It's just, you have to thread it all together really well, and if it doesn't, if you don't thread and get all that data perfect, you're going to have a massive injury.
There's a lot riding on it.
I always think with Hardline, you can tell who's up for it on day one. Like, I've always thought that, like, as soon as the guys arrive, there's so much testosterone that week. It is insane. Like, I've never experienced anything like it. Like, from course walk, and then that first day on the bikes, you can tell who's up for it. And some boys are there and they're riding and they're enjoying it, and they're at one level, and then there's like one or two guys who are there, like, out of the gate, first day of practice, just like on it, and you're quite limited on practice and how much time we get, and there's a lot to learn, and so straight away that who's going to be on it, and it usually comes through.
It does, definitely. And you've got the beautiful Welsh hillside to build on, but that comes with the fact that it's probably going to rain at some point. You've had a few years that have remained dry, but how do you build a track that is so gnarly that it's intimidating and scary for the best riders in the world in the dry, that you can still race and ride on in the wet? Like, that must be a really hard balance to get right.
Yeah, that is insanely hard.
Well, you can't really, and you can't really ride hardline in the wet. But we do sometimes we have to.
There was one year, wasn't it, that it was wet, and it blew my mind that the guys kept riding. And like, I was so impressed with the guys that year, like to keep hitting that stuff. And luckily they hit it in the dry first, so they could get their heads around it. But then to see them like change their mentality and be able to do it in the wet was insane.
And honestly, there's nothing scarier. You're driving into the event that morning, driving down that long road, and the mountain is just above you there, dark and misty and cloudy, and it's going to be so wet and so slippery, and you've got to go up there and get all the way down this mountain, and it's just terrifying. You're just hitting one feature and thinking, right, I got through that. What's next?
Yeah, and it's not like a World Cup where it gets hot and it dries out in like an hour.
Oh, no.
Like Wales takes about a month to dry out, right?
Yeah, and you just know it's going to be hard. It's going to be slippery, and it's probably going to be a bit windy as well. You're speed tucking into a 90-foot double, trying to wipe a bit of mud off your goggle ends or make sure your tyres are clear. And it's kind of ridiculous.
How do you guys feel about the injury rate? Like, it's definitely come down over the years. And like you said, as an event organizer in this instance, I guess like you have a responsibility to the riders, but you're also trying to create something that's hard, it's in the name, and driving the progression of the sport. How do you look at that balance between challenge and risk? It's
actually insane how personally you take it. There was one year and we would just get practice. We just had so many injuries, and we were getting to the point where we were like, we're going to have to stop the event. It was windy, it was really dry that year, and the wind was just taking people out, and not necessarily blowing them off their bikes, but like the jumps are so big, and if you get like a 3 or 4 mile an hour difference in tailwind compared to headwind, the variables are so big, and people weren't used to that. Maybe these days like Fest Series riders would be able to get their heads around that, but these were World Cup riders, and they weren't used to doing jumps that big. They weren't used to being in the air that long, and so we got to the point where we were just like, we're going to have to stop the event, because we didn't have many riders left, and we were like, we need to get to finals. And B, it was just like, it was taking quite a personal like toll on people. All the guys from Red Bull and me and Gee and Rach were feeling it quite personally.
Yeah, fair.
And it's hard to make that decision with how much you throw it to the riders and leave it to them to make decisions, versus how much we make a decision and say, guys, this is what needs to happen. Because the riders want to ride, they want to race, and it's sometimes quite crazy, how hard they'll push and what they'll keep pushing through in order to, do the event. And sometimes you almost need to take that off them and take that decision away from them and say, no, this is happening, or we're stopping, or that's not going to work.
And we are actually having that exact problem at the moment with the girls. It's like history repeating itself with hardline women. And we're seeing exactly the same problems as we had with the guys the first 3 or 4 years now with the girls. And it's so hard to say to them, you can't ride anymore. It's such an emotional week for them. They've been training with the guys, they've been following the guys, they've been risking everything, and they've been riding amazingly. Take Tasmania this year for instance. The girls hit everything, and they risked so much, and the rules of the event are that you have to ride everything, and you have to basically do exactly what the guys do, which is insane when you think about it. When you think of the time difference at a World Cup, and so you know, emotionally for them to suddenly say, oh, you haven't hit that last jump, I'm sorry, you can't ride. Like we're definitely at a point where we're learning how to handle it and how to manage that kind of situation, because, you know, they're riding amazingly, and personally I thought the girls rode better in Tasmania this year than the guys, you know, just because of how hard they were pushing.
Yeah.
But how close to like the bubble that like have been okay or not it was, you know, there'd be a practice session and we'd be right on the bubble of whether the wind was okay. So Athy would be stood there like close to the takeoff, making that decision every few seconds whether the wind was okay or not. There was another guy with a speed gun pointing at some of the girls as they were speed tucking into this double, and if they were over 75k then it was okay, and if they were under that he had to jump out and flag them down. Like we were inches from like each girl making it through or not, and it was it's difficult in that moment to be like, is this okay or not?
Yeah.
Is this fine?
Yeah,
or
because
is
we
this
saw
too
the
much?
consequences, right, with Eris. It was
my
like
God,
a horrible crash, and she was only a few inches really off. Like,
and that's a guy with a speed gun having to make that decision in a split second, right? She's 3k under the speed of what needs to be done. Like, is this okay, or do we need to stop her?
And no one wants that on their conscience. No one wants that decision, that split second decision, you know. And it does, at the end of the day, need to come down to the riders. You know, Red Bull and us put in as many kind of safety precautions as we can, and as many rules to help make it fair as we can. But at the end of the day, it does need to come down to the riders, and it is their decision, because that's the only fair way of doing it, really.
Yeah, tricky balance to get, but sounds
hard.
like there's a lot going on to try and keep people safe, which is all you can do, right? Like you say, at the end of the day, it's down to the rider whether they're going to hit stuff or not. Yeah, fair. I want to talk about 2022. A lot of big changes to the track in 2022, right? Like that whole new on-off, the huge 90 foot, like all of that was a new addition, I think, in 2022. What drove those changes? Talk us through all of that a little bit.
I think the progression, you know, knowing that the years where there's big changes and the years where we push the progression hard are the years that the event does well, both from a viewing side and from a rider side as well. You know, something that surprised me is how hungry the riders are to push the sport. You know, I get personal messages from riders saying, build it harder, or you know, progress this or progress that, or and that's something that I was really surprised at, how personally the riders take pushing the progression of the sport, which is pretty inspiring, really.
Yeah, that is amazing to see. A lot of digging work right that year. It was a huge undertaking to make all those changes.
I remember that year when that the 90s had gone in, the on-off had gone in, and I remember there was a day when it was the day that had been chosen to test some of these features because it was getting close to the event. The same day, having just recovered from that massive crash, the gnarly injuries, I was filming a project on the ridge, on the mountain opposite Hardline.
Yeah, literally, we could see him up there.
So I was up there testing all these and filming all these new features with a small crew, Athy and the boys, with a small crew on the opposite side of the mountain, testing the Hardline features. Midway through the day, a heli just comes trundling down the valley, and I'm watching it like, oh no, please don't go over to Hardline. And it just said, they were probably thinking the same, it's going to come me. And it just trundles through and carries on luckily. But that night, after I'd finished filming, they were like, right, now you've finished, we can tell you Athy's had a massive crash testing the on-off, and he's gone to hospital, you better go meet him. So I trundled down to...
I was expecting it to be the other way around.
Athy's there on it. Yeah, true.
Well, someone's got a guinea pig these things, right?
Yeah, that's actually... Testing Hardline is one of the hardest things, I think, both from our side and from Red Bull's side moving forward, is because back in the day it was just us with a small crew. Sometimes we'd take like one of our mates who was good at like first aid up, and it was quite a controlled situation, and quite like, it probably wasn't a safe situation, but it was controlled. And now hardline testing has turned into quite like it's not a media event, but like there's definitely like a grey area as to like, should you publicize hardline testing? And we've all seen like the footage that came out of that that canyon gap, and it's such a hard one,
Yeah,
like,
for 10 years there's been this whole underground, like private, secret, uncovered, testing of hardline that in my eyes is the gnarliest point of the event,
and nobody sees it either.
Yeah, and
that's the hard thing.
It's been kept quiet because 75% of the time it doesn't
work
well out.
But then on the other hand, there's this amazing footage, as you saw with Jim Monroe, getting ejected over the canyon. And so, how do you
but we learned from last year, like people are ready for hardline, and they're ready to see riders hit hardline. They're not ready for hardline testing. Like, that isn't okay.
Yeah.
It was insane to see the backlash that we both got from that whole testing of the canyon gap being thrown open to the world.
And it wasn't much different to other years.
No, not at all.
We didn't film the road gap testing. Some of the features that we've built before have been not okay and were taken out.
Yeah.
But nobody saw them.
Yeah.
And yes, the canyon gap was a big step, but in terms of the actual consequence for the rider.
But the difference last year was that testing was thrown open to everyone watched every minute of it. For whatever reason, someone decided that would be fine. And, people saw what goes into the testing, but because they'd not really seen much of it before, they thought this was something new, this was something terrifying. Up to the event, I would be getting like messages and messages, like angry people, like really upset, like really like hating on me, like threatening me, like saying that it was ridiculous. Kids' mums who were like taking part in the event messaging me like, "You've lost your shit, you don't know what you're doing, you've had too many concussions, I'm going to sue you." Like really aggressive, unpleasant, personal messages, like really gnarly, because suddenly they'd been exposed to the reality that is hardline testing.
And that whole process is to make sure things are safe and rideable, right?
Yeah. And in Tazzy, Dave McMillan's crash was insane, like one of the horriblest things I've ever seen in my life. But out of respect, nobody ever saw it. And it's such a hard like balance. You're pushing the sport, and you're testing these insane things that shouldn't be done on a bike, really. And you want the outcome to be good, because you only need one or two people to hit it before you know how fast you need to go, what tweaks need to be done, and then the chances are that most people will be all right. As soon as you've seen one person do it, you learn so much from that, and that's what hardline testing is. And nowadays the consequences are so high. The jumps are so big, and the room for error is so small on a mountain bike. These aren't motorbikes. The room for error is tiny. So
I also think people are so, they're used to watching these guys make incredible features look so easy. You watch the top three from last year, they flow down the course and it makes it look effortless. And the amount of people, that say to us, "I'd like to try that road cap, it looks kind of chilled." And it's because they've just seen all the riders in the world hit it, and the best riders in the world hit it really well. So it looks kind of chilled. But I think when you suddenly expose them to the testing and the crashes and what can go wrong, it's a bit of a shock, and perhaps it's not something we should do for the future.
Yeah, maybe. Was it a hard decision to take the canyon gap out, or was it an easy decision once you'd seen it in action?
I think it should have stayed in.
You're still on that page.
I was on the adjust it, make it right, because the feature was big. It wasn't overly big. Was it bigger than anything else we've done? No, not really. It went wrong because, when you build a feature, it's hard to get a takeoff and a transition right first time. And we should have adjusted it. Well, we did adjust it and made it right, and it looked kind of chilled. It looked perfect. The problem was there'd been such a backlash by this point. You know, there'd been a media backlash, and people were quite upset. I think, you know, people got nervous, and it had to come out.
I guess it was a consequence thing, right? Like the at least looking at it anyway, from the imagery that we saw. I've not been on site. I've seen it from the road, but I've not been on site since you put it in. Like, it looked like if you came up short, it was going to be absolutely horrific. And I think maybe that's what people were kind of more concerned about. I don't know.
Yeah, definitely. But you know, Gee tagged the road gap by like 3 or 4 inches one year and just atomized his back wheel, you know, let alone if you saw if someone rolled in, you know, to that road gap, if someone made a mistake coming into that, the consequences on that would be far worse than the canyon gap.
Okay.
You know, if your front wheel slid coming around the corner on that road gap, or if you snapped your handlebars when you pulled off the takeoff, or you got a front wheel flat, the consequences and the distance you would fall would be a lot worse than the canyon gap.
Interesting.
But nobody thinks about that because it hasn't happened.
Yeah.
So, like, you know, it's only when something happens that people are like,
I think that, the spectacle of the canyon gap as well, because it is going over that like natural canyon down.
Yeah, it captures hill, your, you know, those emotions and those fears that we naturally have.
It makes you go, it's got that thing about it. Yeah.
But you know, the exposure stood on the end of the road gap versus stood on the end of the canyon. I would say, you know, it's pretty scary standing on the end of that road gap. Like,
it's huge.
The consequences are massive.
Yeah. Fair. So out of all the things that you've both guinea pigged over the years, which one's kind of given you the biggest fear when you first hit it?
I think there's been so many. There's been so many features where I've, you know, been there, parked up on the hill, right, I'm about to drop in, and I was so nervous for it. But because, you know, me and Athy have ridden together and ridden the stuff that we've built for so many years, it kind of just works. You know, when Athy says to me, right, drop in, I reckon a touch of brakes, tuck there, pump off that, and a little pop, I kind of know what he means by that.
Yeah, okay. You speak the same language.
And vice versa. Whereas if it was a completely different track and someone else had built it and you're just speed tucking into this enormous, like, it's so much harder then. And I think because we've had that kind of, that's always been the process, like, over the last 10 years, you know, the kind of build together, ride it together, test it together, it kind of just naturally has worked well.
Yeah, fair.
But always pretty terrifying.
Yeah. Dan, anything that stands out in your memory?
I think, you know, testing that road gap the first year, because it was so different to anything that we'd done, and the consequences were so high, and even now, like, every year you come back to it, you think, oh, this year it'll feel a bit more chilled because we've had 10 years of hitting it, and it's still so scary, you know. The exposure on it is still insane, and to see G hit it first year and just clean it perfectly, it was, and yeah, insane.
It's got bigger from the first year, right? Did it go?
Yeah.
It went higher.
Yeah, we've sawn the end off it and lifted it up a bit.
Yeah, because it was too easy.
But it's mind-blowing that we've ridden it so many times, and it is quite chilled when you're riding it, but every year, like Athy says, you turn up and you think, wow, that's bigger than I remember.
Yeah.
It's still terrifying.
It's an incredible, I mean, I haven't been for a few years, but I've been like maybe 2019 or something. And this thing looks big on the TV. It looks big in the photos. It does that where a lot of races struggle, but it still doesn't do it justice. You go and see it in real life, and it's like, it is mind blowing how gnarly that place is.
Yeah, it's enormous.
Yeah, I highly recommend if anyone's able to get there. Like, spectating is well worth a day. And 2022 is the first year we had women involved, right? I think so. I think Tiny Seagrave was kind of earmarked for it, and had been pushing to make it happen, but unfortunate injuries kind of kept her away, and it was Jess Blewitt that turned up that first year. I think it was just Jess, right?
Yeah, there weren't many, were there? There weren't many. I think it was a similar situation to, you know, the guys early on. That ring around pre-event, like, are you up for this?
No,
absolutely not.
I think there was a few girls there, but yeah, I think when it came to actually riding it, and I think the weather was a bit bad as well, so that's definitely, like, like Gee was saying earlier, has a huge impact.
And it was cool to see though, right? She got properly stuck into it. Unfortunately, got injured, but like took away rider of the week, which is really cool.
Insane, like doing that big drop after the metal ramp was pretty scary for the men, let alone for Jess to hit that. It was insane.
I think that's what she got injured on in the end, wasn't it?
Blew her ankle. Yeah.
She landed well, but still, just the force of it But it was amazing, like Athy says, this year in Tasmania, seeing the girls, what they were throwing themselves into was wild. I mean, the injuries were too high this year, especially in the girls. There were a lot of crashes and a lot of injuries, and the number was too high in my eyes. But it was amazing to see they were just, throwing themselves into such gnarly stuff.
Yeah, it's cool. And you put a bit of effort into giving the women a bit more time to kind of close that gap to the guys, right? So you've had a women's sort of progression day or 2 days where Bernard took them up on the hill, I think a couple of years ago maybe. Yeah,
they normally start a little bit earlier than the guys, just to get their heads around it a bit more. But it's just so much, it's so useful for them to ride with the guys. If they're there by themselves, it's such a different scenario.
Yeah, Hardline's terrifying if you're there at any other time other than that like main practice session where everyone's really fired up. There's a great vibe. Everyone's just following each other through. Loads of people around. It's a good atmosphere. Then that's when Hardline practice works. But if you're up there with just a couple of people, it's a bit quiet, a bit damp. The line's not really bedded in. It's quite an intimidating place to be.
It's not somewhere you go for a Sunday afternoon spin, no?
Absolutely not.
Everyone used to ask us the first few years. Everyone was like, "Oh, do you guys ride Hardline outside of the event?" And you just don't. Like, there's just no way. And every year, people are, the dig crew are like, "Oh, we're going to go and ride it after," and no way, no one ever does. It's just so full on. You got to be on your A game like from day one.
Yeah. So 10 years in 2024, and we added Maydena, which we've mentioned in Tasmania as a second Hardline event. Like, was that always part of the plan? And like, how did Maydena become part of this thing that you guys have created?
It was never part of the plan. No, I mean, we started Hardline, and it was, an event that maybe would happen as a one-off, and we'd see how it would go, and then it, went okay. They did it again, and it's just picked up momentum and grown, and gradually, we spoke about the idea of having another one, but we knew how hard it would be to find somewhere to do a second Hardline, and when we started looking, it was difficult to find, but at the same time, we knew it would be pretty cool to have a second one, and it would be pretty cool to try and have one that was still Hardline, but different, a different element to it. And so we didn't want a second Hardline Wales. It had to be different, and that's why we ended up in Maydena.
Yeah. When you found Maydena, like, how did you go about making sure that it like matched your expectations for what Hardline should be?
I think the first year, well, the first time I went to Maydena, like the first time I got off the plane in Hobart and kind of drove from Hobart up to Maydena, I remember thinking this is a cool feeling. Like, it felt like we were at the end of the earth. We'd flown for so long to get there, and then it definitely feels like off the beaten track. Like, it felt like Wales. It felt like out of the way, removed, remote, and it had all the like hallmarks of like a similar feeling event, which is really important. And all the guys down there were so passionate. From the day we turned up, they were like, you could just tell that they were so invested. They were so into it. And so that was like a huge motivation for going down there.
Yeah. And how were you like feeling about it that first year? Because there was press, like, again, the top riders in the world turn up, surprisingly make it look easy, and everyone thinks it is easy, but obviously it's not. Like, how did you guys take that?
Well, I wasn't there the first year. I'd written myself off at Rampage, so I missed that kind of that early scouting, the building, the first race, and I got I heard people saying it was quite easy and looked quite chilled.
I think it was really good for G to not be there, because I was there getting the story on the ground, and he was like he was kind of removed from it and getting the vibe that the rest of the world was probably getting. So it was quite cool to like talk to him about it and see like what we needed to change for the next year.
But also when I turned up the second year expecting, you know, something quite calm, something quite chilled, I did the track walk and I was blown away. I said, this is insane. This isn't a chilled, you know, easy version of Hardline.
Yeah.
Like, this is a gnarly track. It had lost that, you know, Lomi first year softness, and it had turned into this fast, aggressive, hard packed, high speed track that there was no room for error in.
Yeah, it's the speed out there that's insane.
And it was, you know, from the first practice run, I hadn't ridden anything that fast for a long time. So, you know, you're having to react to like 2 turns ahead on some of the sections because you're going so fast, like speed tugging through. There's a section you do a turn, hit a step down, and then I remember there was like, I think there was 7 fast gaps before I remember where you had to do a tag of the brakes, and I just remember counting through them, like counting this down before the tiny little brake tap. And then if you got any of that wrong or misjudged it, or, you know, the speed out there is insane. And the gaps are huge, the track's long, it's rough, and you know, it was a rough practice session this year. You know, it was a lot of people coming unstuck, a lot of people crashing, and it was quite a gnarly event to be at. You know, it kind of reminded me of those, like you were saying, where, you know, all these crashes were happening and you get to the point where you don't want to see another like red flag and another person on the floor, and, you know, because you're friends with these people, you love these people, and, you know, seeing them getting beaten to pieces and a track like Tasmania just ripping everyone to shreds is kind of brutal.
I think in the early years of Wales, you know, we had a lot of crashes and a lot of injuries, but the speed was quite low. Like the hill is really steep, and so you never really get going that fast, compared to Tazzy, where the hill's quite chilled, and the distance that you're covering in Tasmania, like, is actually insane. Like, I think if people walked the track and appreciated how long the track is, like, compared to how fast they're doing it, it is mental.
Yes. I remember that, like, you would be early practice sessions, you would be coming into that fast bottom bit around these flat out berms and shark fins, and you're speed tucking. You're like, wow, this is pretty much the fastest I've ever been on a bike. You know,
there's no point pedaling.
This feels fast. There's no point pedaling. The wind is just blasting past you, and you're speed tucked towards this huge lip, and you have to take off at that speed. Yeah. It doesn't feel right taking off at that speed. You know, you feel like you're going to take off and just never land. And then you fly off the lip out of this speed tuck and stretch, and you just make the landing by like a few inches, which is an insane feeling.
Yeah. How do you see that venue progressing? Do you guys have much involvement in like the year-on-year changes there?
Yeah, the guys out there are pretty good at, they, because of the way their winter falls, they kind of get on it quite early in terms of changes.
I think I had to do like 4 flights to Tasmania from the UK in like 6 weeks last year.
Yeah. The first time we went, Matt Bowl called me and he said, do you want to go to Tasmania for 2 days? And I was just like,
takes 2 days to get there,
mate. We flew for 2 days, we were on the ground for 2 days, and we flew home for 2 days. And we did that like 3 times. It was an amazing experience, you know. It was just so intense, you know. You landed and you were like boom, 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 and then you took off and you were like, oh, crazy.
But it's hard going somewhere like Tasmania with a mind to, you know, right, we need another Hardline, and it's hard to not just think of Hardline Wales, and it's hard to just think, you know, we need to reproduce Hardline Wales, because we knew it had to be different, and we knew it had to be its own thing with its own challenges, and it was difficult to know what that should look like in that, you know, those early years. But I think it's found its feet really well, and the first year it was kind of settling a bit, but this year, I think, well, this second year, it was an incredible event, really cool event.
Yeah, it was great to watch.
And the hard thing with Tasmania is that that Hardline had already been established for 10 years. And so it had already established itself as what it was as an event. People had huge expectations of Hardline. The media coverage of Hardline is insane every year. So when we flew into Tazzy, just the hype and the expectation from all the locals and trail builders and was just like off the chart, you know, like as well as the passion, you know, because everyone wanted to get their passion across, you know. And so for me, I was a little bit overwhelmed, you know, by it, because Wales had just grown from this tiny little idea slowly over years. You know, it's found its own way, and it hasn't been forced at all at any point. But Tasmania, it had to be forced, because the expectation was so high from everyone that you couldn't just let it go, and you couldn't just let it be. It's, you know, you couldn't let it be what it would be, because it had to be on a par with Wales, which is pretty gnarly coming into that.
It's a tough ask, but now you've put a second venue into Hardline mix. Will it be easier to add a third, do you think?
I think it'll be hard. Like, one of the hardest things now is that the calendar is so full. Tasmania is easy because it's in the southern hemisphere, so it gives us more time to play with. Yeah. Adding another venue into the northern hemisphere is going to be a challenge for sure. Red Bull are really keen. I think one thing I've been surprised at is how, like, the uptake from different countries in terms of Red Bull, and how many countries want it, how many countries want Hardline. It's crazy to see.
That's really good, though. Shows what you've created, right?
But I think it will happen. You know, I think a third round is on the cards, and you know, it would be sick, because 3 rounds, it's a series then, and you know, you suddenly got this. You know, you basically get through one Hardline event and think, right, there's another one coming up, and then there's another one coming up, and
you can chase an overall at that point, right? Like 2 rounds, it doesn't really make sense. But
I don't think we go too far down that kind of series race. You know, we don't want to complicate it and turn it into this kind of difficult to follow. Like, it needs to stay simple and raw, and you know, it needs to stay as Hardline, just a gnarly, fast downhill race.
Yeah. And I think ultimately you want the event to be about pushing the progression of mountain biking. So yes, we might get to a point where there's 3 events, but I see them very much as like standout events that, you know, really kind of push the bar, and each event is like very different from the other, and everyone knows that they're there to progress the sport rather than to try and like win an overall. That's gonna happen, you know, inevitably that'll happen, because these guys are like eating out for breakfast, these courses, you know, and it's so hard to make them hard enough so the guys are like, okay, I'm not thinking about racing, I'm just thinking about riding the course. The guys are so good these days that it's hard to do that.
So what's changed for 2025 in Wales then? What should we expect?
Well, it's not a year of big changes. There's some changes, and it's all about making that track more of a race track. I think, you know, the focus was, we didn't want it to just be guys kind of cruising down the mountain and a few boys getting through and a few not, and whoever was fastest wins. You know, we wanted it to be a race, you know, because that's so exciting to watch. And last year was great, seeing those little battles and seeing how close the rivalries were for those top spots. And, you know, that's what we focused on for this year.
I think last year, in terms of engagement, was like the best year we'd ever had. I mean, yes, every year you get a lot of people watching, but maybe it drops off. But last year, because of the way it worked, and each rider was going faster and faster and faster, and the engagement just kind of went up. And the feedback that Red Bull had got from it was crazy, you know, in terms of like people just hungry for that race.
And it is, you know, when you see the coverage it gets, you know, the amount of people watching it, the amount of people watching it all around the world, it's it's wild to see the attention it's getting. And, it's because it's easy to follow. It's a wild race. The fastest man wins. It's insane to watch, even if you're not really, tight in the mountain bike scene. We just want it so that anybody can kind of tune in, see what's going on, and instantly think, wow, what's happening?
Like
here?
Rampage in that way. I think it pulls in people way beyond the core of the sport, right?
Yeah.
Which is super cool because it's eyes on what we love, which is really good.
And that's always been, both of our focuses is, help the sport grow, do what you can to show the sport to more people. And, that's always been quite a driving factor for us to push Hardline.
Good stuff. So does the Canyon Gap make an appearance on the 2025 track?
You have to wait and see. It doesn't.
That's a shame. It's just too much to get it to a situation where everyone would be happy to put it in, or?
No, I think it would have been fine for it to go in and it would have been safe. But I think, when you have something that gets a certain amount of bad publicity, then,
'Cause I guess if someone did get hurt on it now, like the amount of, it's not
it wasn't
worth
that
it.
we had to make something more safe, or it just had to be different. So
But you'd built quite a lot of track above that, right? To kind of get into it. Are you able to utilize some of that? Have you found a way to get into it, or is that all kind of a write-off?
Yeah, that section from what was the new section last year down to the canyon, we can't really use it.
Okay.
But I think people should take like reassurance from it, that in terms of like Red Bull taking responsibility, yes, they're supporting these amazing events and they're pushing hard, but at the same time they do listen and they do kind of take stuff on board, and they take that overall view, which is reassuring,
And I think Red Bull are great at that, on the one hand, they can be at the event, Craig Evans can be running around the field naked, dressed in a bin bag with his cock poking through a hole with a beer in his hand, and Red Bull are cool with that. But at the same time, when it is time to, step in and say, we need to, this is too far or this is dangerous, they will be there to reel things in. And, me and Athy know whilst it's an event that's close to our heart, we're not the only ones involved, and we can't just have, a free reign of whatever goes in there. There's lots of people to, take into account.
Yeah, fair comment. And a big part of this is the broadcast, right? Like, that's how it gets to everyone. That's how we all consume it. And I think the commentary team is a very important part of making a broadcast fly. Like, did you guys get a say in who sits in the commentary and provides that for your event?
I think it was always going to be Warner. There's going to be no one better.
Not a hard choice.
Yeah, fair. And is Elliot coming this year as well, I think?
Who's joining Warner this year? I actually know who it is, but obviously that's not been announced yet.
Okay.
It'll be a surprise, I think.
Interesting.
Yeah.
All right.
You'll like it.
Will I?
Yeah.
Excellent.
Everyone will.
Good stuff. So 10 years, or 11 years now of Red Bull Hardline. Do you see yourself still doing this in another 10 years' time? And if you do, like, what do you think Hardline 10 years in the future might look like?
I think every year you always think how much more, and so many people say surely we've reached the peak of where we can go with bikes and the technology, but the riders are they're just so hungry for that progression. And I think as long as that hunger's there, and as long as the hunger's there from the industry as well to keep pushing the technology, so these guys trust that their bikes aren't going to break, they trust that they can push as hard as they can. When you watch, we've been up there with some of the moto guys like Billy and Johnny, and to see what is possible on a motorbike, it does make you think, okay, we are not there yet on the mountain bikes. There is a lot more room for progression, both from the industry in terms of the technology and from riders as well.
In like the scale of the features, or like where do you see that progression able to happen?
I think everything,
Yeah.
So many years people ask us this, like, surely that's as far as you can push, and surely, but we've always approached it with this mindset, and not just Hardline, but everything we do, whether it's Atherton bikes or the bike park to some extent, or Hardline, we've always approached it with this mindset of what could we do next? How far can we push this? And like Athy says, it's not just about making the track bigger and the riders pushing harder. Everything has to evolve with it, and if the bikes improve, the riders are getting stronger and faster and more talented each year and more willing to take on bigger and bigger stuff. The track can grow with that, and perhaps we're close to reaching a limit of the track which we're on now, and perhaps we have to move things about and find a slightly different spot to grow into. But there's growth there for sure, and there's no end to what it can do.
Nice. Excited to see it. It's been a real pleasure sitting down with the two of you and hearing a bit about the last 11 years and the crazy things that you've created. But on behalf of all the fans, thank you for what you do, because it definitely nudges things in a cool, progressive direction, and we appreciate it. If people want to watch Red Bull Hardline 2025, it's Red Bull TV, I guess, if they want to.
Red Bull TV, 26th, 27th of July. Not long now. Tune in.
Excellent. Good stuff. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, man.
Thank you, and hopefully see a lot of the guys at the Hardline event.
See you there. Cheers, boys.
Take care.
Thank you.